afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's public talk, Crafting Japanese Immigrant Nationalism in 1930s Hawaii by Professor Nippu Jiji from the University of Hawaii. My name is Kei Ueda. I'm the curator of the Japanese Diaspora Collection and a research fellow at the Hoover Institute of Library Archives. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to express my heartfelt gratitude to our director, Condoleezza Rice, the board of overseers, all our supporters. And a special thank you goes to Professor Emeritus John Stefan, whose endowment has been instrumental in supporting the Japanese diaspora. Today's event is structured into three parts. First, Professor Azuma will discuss the past scholarly contributions to Japanese Americans, particularly the pioneering work of Professors Yasuo Sakata, John Stefan, and Yuji. Following his remarks, I'll share the significance and journey behind the creation of our edited volume, Japanese America on the Eve of. And of course, the main part of today's event is Professor Koizaki, who will start with his speech. Now, let me introduce Professor Azuma. Professor Azuma is the Roy F. Janetti Nicholas Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. He specializes in Japanese American history, transpacific migration, diaspora, and territorial, and inter-imperial relations between the United States and Japan. He is the author of the award-winning Between Two Empires, Great History, and Transnationalism in Japanese America, and co-editor of two anthologies, including the Oxford Handbook of Asian American History. His latest research monograph, entitled Our Frontier, Japanese America and Territorial Colonialism in the Construction of Japan's Borderless Empire, has received the 2020 John K. Fairbanks Prize in East Asian History, American Historical. His third monograph, Brokering the Race War, Japanese Americans in the Pacific and the occupation of Japan, is forthcoming from Oxford. Professor Azuma has been teaching the work. Now, let me assist welcome Professor Azuma.
Thank you, Dr. Ueda, for your introduction. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the public lecture of the Japanese Diaspora Initiative Workshop, featured Professor Mireko Ikari of the University of Hawaii. As a Hoover visiting fellow, I have had a pleasure Ueda on the Japanese Diaspora Initiative for the past 4 years while conducting my own research and writing. One of our collaborations, the publication of Japanese America on the Eve of the Pacific War, is part of the JDI, Japanese Diaspora Initiative, endeavor to advance the empirical study of Japanese migration and diaspora by re-examining the forward-looking visions and insights of pioneering scholar, Professor Yasuo Sakata. The Hoover Institution Library and Archive is home to Sakata's personal papers, which include Japanese language primary source material and transcripts of rare immigrant newspapers. His professional career has been dedicated to the development of both scholarship on and research archives for Japanese American and migration history. Combined with the Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection, a massive online database of overseas Japanese newspapers, the Yasuo Sakata papers form an important component of Hoover's Japanese Diaspora Initiative and its archival collection under the curatorial leadership of Dr. Ueda. Yasuo Sakata's career and scholarship have overarched both U.S. and Japanese academia. Amidst the emergence of Japanese American history as an academic field during the 1960s, he pursued his doctoral degree in Japanese history at UCLA, played an instrumental role in the development of the Japanese American Research Project collection there in UCLA with Yuji Ichioka, and eventually returned to Japan in 1990 to take a professorship at the Osaka Gakuen University and help establish Japanese Association for Migration Studies. For this reason, Sakata's standing as a founder. So for this reason, Sakata's standing as a founder of Japanese migration studies is well recognized and in the Japanese language scholarly world. Yet, it is regrettable that his excellent scholarship and visions for the history of Japanese migration and diaspora has gone largely unnoticed in the Anglophone academia, since Sakata has mostly published in Japanese. The recognition of this situation propelled Dr. Ueda and I to take up a project of putting together a special anthology titled Japanese America on the Eve of Pacific War. Dr. Ueda will tell you more about the volume and then JDI in general later, but here I will concentrate on how the project came about relative to the often neglected scholarships of pioneer historians like Sakata. The inspiration for this project stemmed from Sakata's seminal essay published in Japanese in 1995, translated and featured as Chapter 1 of the anthology. Organized around the theme of Untold 1930s, this edited volume pays tribute to Sakata's role as a foremost historian of early Japanese America and Transpacific migration. Indeed, by carving out a new area of research and interpretation in Japanese American history, Sakata's chapter is full of valuable historiographical insights and methodological innovations. It especially provides an opportunity for younger generations of Anglophone scholars to reflect on Sakata's enormous contributions while also elucidating how closely his scholarship is intertwined with well-known English works of other pioneering historians like late Yuji Ichioka, who was a long-term friend and intellectual ally of Sakata since the 1960s, and is now widely recognized as a sort of a godfather of Japanese American studies in the Anglophone academia. I would also like to mention the important role of Dr. John J. Stefan, Professor Emeritus of Japanese History at the University of Hawaii, in relation to Sakata's intellectual interventions and contributions exemplified by our edited volume. Both Hoover's Japanese Diaspora Initiative and the compilation of Sakata Anthology are originally Professor Stefan's brainchildren. In addition to Sakata and Ichioka, Professor Stefan is a trailblazer in the field of Japanese diaspora studies, and he wanted to see Sakata's contributions and visions accessible to non-Japanese speaking audience. Some of Sakata's major historiographical interventions, of which the other two giants also partook, revolve around his view of the 1930s as a historical vacuum in the academic literature on Japanese Americans. Sakata contends that that vacuum constitutes a chronological and conceptual missing link between the accumulated studies of pre-1924 immigration exclusion and the massive scholarship on the wartime mass incarceration. In Chapter 1 of the anthology, Sakata expounds on key reasons for the existence of this vacuum and the skewed understandings and the methodological problems such uneven historiographical coverage engendered in the field of Japanese American history. One factor he touches on in his concluding remarks of that chapter suggests the enduring impact of Sakata's seminal essay, originally published in 1995. That year, 1995, marked the 50th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War, and followed by only a few years, the successful conclusion of Japanese Americans' movement for redress and reparations for their unconstitutional imprisonment by the US government during the same war. Thus, when Sakata published his Japanese essay in the inaugural issue of the Japanese Association for Migration Studies Annual Review of Migration Studies, Immigrant Nationalism, war-related topics still drew intense attention from the public and scholarly world. In this context, critical reappraisals of the Pacific War and its prehistory merged with Sakata's call for the closure of a taboo in Japanese American studies. That taboo is complicated relations between pre-war Japanese America and Imperial Japan, including the immigrant support for Japan's military aggression in China during the 1930s. Sakata explained how that taboo accounted for the prevailing absence of scholarly attention to that decade. I quote from his chapter, quote, at the beginning of quote, almost every Nikkei researcher in Japanese American studies was directly involved in the fight for redress movement. They feared that those who still had racially discriminatory views against the Japanese and Japanese Americans would take advantage of the Japanese immigrants' loyalty to their Japanese ancestral land, if disseminated as a historical fact, to support their anti-redress view and claim to be legitimate, end quote. In other words, Sakata appropriately observed the scholarly dilemma and moral conundrum in which an honest historical study might inadvertently provide an opportunity for the political use of a history of Japanese immigrants' patriotic activities by reactionary bigots and racists against Japanese Americans' struggle for redress in a contemporary political context. With the successful conclusion of the redress movement in the late 1930s, however, 1980s, however, Sakata felt it necessary for historians to move forward, thus urging us to delve seriously into what he called the, quote, the 1930s impact on the historical research of Japanese America, end quote. Published in English, research monographs of Ichioka and Stefan mirrored Sakata's ideas explicated in his opening chapter in the anthology. Organized around Sakata's call, Japanese America on the eve of the Pacific War forms not only our humble attempt to add to those pioneering English language works by Ichioka and Stefan, but it is also an effort to make Sakata's vision more widely visible to Anglophone scholars of Japanese migration and diaspora. The broad area of contributors to that anthology and the diverse historical topics and subjects that they explore reveal Sakata's status as a role model and trailblazer. His influence has not been limited to Japanese American history. He also made his mark in many other associated fields and topics, including but not limited to history of diplomacy and geopolitics, international trade, and immigrant or ethnic nationalism. Taking up these topics and more, some contributors to the anthology are Japan-based associates of Sakata, who have either produced their original essays or permitted their Japanese language works to be translated for the volume. Other contributors are Anglophone scholars who authored brand new historical studies in response to Sakata's call for serious empirical research on the untold 1930s. Directly or indirectly, both groups of contributors share or are inspired by Sakata's scholarly interventions. Today's pre-workshop public lecture features the author of one of the chapters who produced an original study, Dr. Mira Koikari. Her chapter is extremely important to the anthology because it directly addresses a core of the historical taboo Sakata illuminated in his seminal essay. Focusing on the patriotic activities of Japanese Americans in the 1930s Hawaii, Koikari's chapter and her lecture today will tell us a lot about the blind spots of pre-war Japanese American history. But I must also add her research is important in another way. Beyond what Professor Sakata discussed in his chapter, there has been another largely untold element in Japanese American history. That blind spot is a product of the California or West Coast centered nature of existing scholarship. Hawaii has been relatively neglected in comparison with the volume of the scholarship on continental Japanese America, especially when it comes to the pre-war history of Japanese immigrants, or issei. Professor Koikari's research gives us the first look at the topic of Hawaii issei's patriotic activities toward Japan based on a gender-based analysis of rarely consulted primary source materials produced by and about Japanese immigrants in the islands. Professor Koikari's lecture not only showcased her excellent scholarship relating to the long neglected theme of Hawaii issei's ethnic nationalism and support for their Japanese ancestral home during the 1930s. But her talk also represents a glimpse or presents a glimpse into the fascinating new findings about pre-war Japanese American history that the anthology offers. So we are excited to have Professor Koikari here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Azuma, for your insight into the Japanese American historical research. We continue to benefit from the vision and scholarship of Professor Stefan and Sakata. The Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection, our open access digital collection of Japanese language newspapers published outside Japan, continues to expand both geographical and time scope. Here is the global map showcasing the currently available titles. As you can see, we have grown significantly from our original target of fewer than 20 titles. Notably, you can observe on this map the high concentration of pre-World War II Japanese language newspapers in these tiny dots in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the islands of Hawaii. These newspapers played pivotal roles in the history of Japanese America, and as you know, in the context of the Pacific War. You'll hear more about Hawaii and its Japanese community in Professor Koikari's talk later. Professor Sakata is strongly committed to fostering the next generation of researchers and ensuring the field remains vibrant and dynamic. One example of his dedication is the generous donation of his entire library to the Hoover Institution, which has enabled us to incorporate meticulously transcribed early Japanese American newspapers from San Francisco into the Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection. These newspapers, now part of a searchable database, offer a fascinating glimpse into the past. Even advertisements from 1892 newspaper can be explored using translation tools as well. Here's the example of the advertisement with Mount Fuji on it. It says Japanese-made products such as miso, soy sauce, white rice, dried goods, English-Japanese dictionaries, conversation books, brushes, ink, inkstones, lacquerware, ceramics, silk goods, and other Japanese items, free delivery within the city, and they actually predated Amazon Prime. We humbly request your patronage, offering these items at low prices, and the store was located at 120 Fifth Street in San Francisco, which you can locate in today's map. Building on Professor Sakata's efforts, we've created this late 19th century interactive map of San Francisco Japantown businesses using modern technology to bring these historical documents to life, and we hope to publish it in the near future. Additionally, he donated the Issei Survey, a study of first-generation Japanese American pioneers conducted in 1939. The survey serves as the foundation for one of the most significant historical texts on pre-war Japanese American history, which is the history of Japanese America. For those who are interested, we've made this over 1,000-page English translation of the history of Japanese in America, translated by Seizo Oka of JCCCMC, available through the Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection. Needless to say, their contribution to the field are far greater than we can summarize in just a few minutes. I encourage you to explore them further by visiting the Hoover archives and the Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection. Now let me turn to our edited volume, Japanese America on the Eve of the Pacific War. The book project has been more than just academic endeavor. It has been a labor of passion, deeply rooted in our commitment to expanding the understanding of Japanese American history through various scholarly lenses. First and foremost, one of our primary goals in this volume was to emphasize the importance of primary sourced documents, particularly newspapers. These documents serve as invaluable windows into the past, providing us with real-time accounts, insights, perspectives that are often lost in retrospective analysis. In this volume, the scholars have extensively utilized these primary sources to ground their research in the lived experiences and voices of Japanese Americans during this critical period. Second, we sought to introduce significant academic contributions from Japan-based scholars to the broader English-speaking academic community. By translating their seminar articles into English, we aim to bridge a crucial gap in the field. The chapters I personally translated from Japanese into English are marked with the dictionary icons on these slides for easy identification. Many of these scholars' research has not been accessible in English language journals or books, and we believe their inclusion enriches our understanding of Japanese American history, providing fresh and often overlooked perspectives. Third, we wanted to bring quote-unquote fresh air into the field of Japanese American history by inviting scholars from disciplines outside of this specific area of study. Our public speaker today, Professor Koikari's work, is a successful example of this interdisciplinary approach. Another notable contributor is Professor Toshihiko Kishi, a historian of East Asia. His expertise in the political and military affairs of East Asia on the eve of Pacific War allowed him to scrutinize the activities of a Japanese Hawaiian journalist, providing nuanced insights into the broader geopolitical context. By including such scholars, we aim to demonstrate the complexity of the Japanese American diaspora, highlighting the movements of people, ideas, information, and goods, as well as the dynamics that transcend borders, nations, and communities. Fourth, we were committed to fostering the next generation of scholars by inviting younger academics such as Rashad Eshak, a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, to contribute to this volume. This initiative aligns with our belief that the field must continue to evolve, building on the foundational work of pioneering scholars such as Professor Sakata, Stefan, and Ichioka. We hope that by giving a platform to these emerging voices, we can inspire and set a milestone for future scholars to follow. Lastly, but by no means least, this volume is also aligned with the Hoover Institution Library and Archives' long-standing mission to focus on political, economic, and military history. Given the nature of the topics covered and the primary sources utilized, it made sense for us to maintain this focus, ensuring that our work continues to contribute to these broader historical narratives. This emphasis is particularly demonstrated in these last chapters, as you can see on this slide. And one of the contributors, Professor Minohara's talk at the Hoover Book Club, is available online for those who are interested. In conclusion, Japanese America on the eve of Pacific War is more than just a collection of academic essays. It is a reflection of our collective efforts to deepen the understanding of a pivotal time in history. It bridges linguistic and disciplinary divides, fosters new scholarly voices, and remains anchored in the rigorous analysis of primary sources. We hope that this volume will serve as a valuable resource for scholars, students, and anyone who is interested in the complex history of Japanese America. Without further ado, now let me introduce Professor Mire Koikari. Professor Koikari is a professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Born and raised in Japan, she earned her MA and PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison prior to her relocation to Hawaii in 1997. Her research interests include gender, race, militarism, and transnationality in the 19th and 20th centuries. She's the author of Pedagogy of Democracy, feminism and the Cold War in the US occupation of Japan, Cold War encounters in the US occupied Okinawa, women, militarized domesticity and transnationalism in East Asia, and gender, culture, and disaster in post 3.11 Japan, which was also translated in Russian. Our current research project, Cultivating Masculinity for the Oceanic Empire, Marine Visions and Maritime Strategies in Japan's Pelagic Frontier, examines the construction of oceanic masculinity in Imperial Japan. Now let's welcome Professor Mireko Ikari.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. So following the remarks by Dr. Asma and Dr. Ueda, I want to give this talk based on the chapter that was published in this volume. And then to start my talk, I want all of you to imagine yourself standing at Honolulu Harbor and then looking onto the ocean. And then coming to your way is a big Imperial Navy vessel like that. So let's start with that imagery. On June 15, 1935, the Japanese immigrant community in Hawaii was buzzing with excitement. Sailing into the Honolulu harbor early in the morning were two Imperial Japanese training vessels. One was called the Asama, the other one was called the Yakumo, bearing the rising sun flag, blasting a 21-gun salute, and bringing 1,600 Kaikoku Kenji, men of the young men of the maritime nation in the middle of their long-distance training exercise where they were going all over the Pacific. The jubilation was barely contained on shore and on board. The welcoming committee, consisting of the first generation male leaders of the immigrant community, was ready to roll out a 4-day program featuring receptions and banquets, small and then judo matches, and of course hula performances and the around the island tour. To reciprocate the island hospitality, the cadets themselves, these young Navy cadets themselves, prepared their own reception event called At Home, where they had served the drinks and then food they prepared, and then also demonstrated all sorts of athletic abilities they had mastered through their training. And the local newspaper, Japanese language newspaper, really played a role in hyping the event and then hyping this visit. The Nippu Jiji, for example, declared that the overseas development of Yamato race, which is a reference to Japanese, was inseparable from the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Hawaii Hochi, its rival newspaper, recounted the history of naval visitation to Hawaii and extolled the scale and then scope of Japan's maritime expansionism. The Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, which is a business magazine, published a special welcome issue containing the portraits of 3 royals on the sea, so-called Umi no Miyasama, whose divine presence raised the patriotic clamor to a fever pitch. The muscular silhouette of Asama and then Yakumo excited the flesh and then blood of Japanese immigrants and then stoked their racial and then national pride, according to the magazine's editorial. Doho, which means compatriots, Doho are being reunited across the vast oceanic divide, a moment overflowing with kangeki, deep emotion, and then nessei, sincere passion. Now, as you might notice, this is a very male masculine scene, but at the center of this masculine spectacle of flesh and then blood and then empire were feminine artifacts of imon bukuro, or comfort bags, piled high on the pier and then ready for distribution as welcome gifts. A small cotton bag sewn by women and then containing cigarettes and then candies and knickknacks, comfort bags was a crystallization of Nikkei patriotism, evidence of their sekisei, sincere passion, and a symbol of their enduring love of the homeland. Now, the making of comfort bags had begun weeks and then months in advance and then generated its own frenzy among female folks across Japanese Hawaii. Issei women, the first generation Japanese women, who are the main force behind this grassroots drive, their sewing hand at home, picking up speed in correspondence to the maritime movements of the approaching ship. So what women are doing at home on the land, very much connected to what men were doing in the oceanic space. Also volunteering their hands and their hearts were students of New Anu Girls Technical High School, Nisei girls, second generation girls, who exemplified Japanese womanhood flowering in the foreign soil, according to this article that you see there. However, unlikely, members of Honolulu Geisha Association also joined the fray under the leadership of Ichimatsu Ne-san, or Geisha Ichimatsu, who is very much a poster girl of Japanese Imperial Navy in Japanese Hawaii. And then these are the pieces that are being published. And then there are more, the narratives about Geisha and then Japanese Imperial Navy circulating within the island. Success beyond all expectation, the sewing campaign produced thousands, literally thousands, of imon bukuro comfort bags. The generosity of Japanese immigrants touched the hearts of the seafaring arrivals, a sentiment very well reflected in the onboard newspapers, which were called Kannai Shinbun in Japanese. And then both of the ships published identical illustrations, the sailors opening the bags and then finding what's inside, and they were very, very happy with the gifts they had received. So, what are the main themes and then questions that I'm going to address today? In this presentation today, I want to examine the rise of Japanese immigrant nationalism in 1930s Hawaii. As Dr. Asuma mentioned, in the historiography of Japanese America, 30s has long been treated as a decade of silence. And the topic of Japanese immigrant nationalism very much an unspoken and an unspeakable topic. It's really a taboo topic in so many ways. Issei and then Nisei, first generation and then second generation, have long insisted on their loyalty to the United States, an assertion made necessary by relentless charges of anti-Americanism, their anti-Americanism, before and during and then even after World War II. However, pro-Japanese pronouncements and then also practices circulate broadly among overseas Japanese, definitely in the decades before the Pacific War, and then Hawaii was really a leading, if not the leading, a leading site in this transnational phenomena that was flourishing in that silent decade. Now, what's really interesting to a gender scholar like myself is that the driving this transnational phenomena were actually women and their handmade objects. Imon bukuro, comfort bag, definitely one. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this, but also imonbun, comfort letters, and then also so-called senninbari, 1,000 stitch amulets. Similar to their counterparts in Japan, Issei and then Nisei women, first generation and second generation women, put together gift bags to comfort the empire's soldiers. And there are roughly two groups who received those heartfelt gifts. One, those aboard the Navy training ships calling on Hawaii, so that's Navy, but also troops deployed in mainland China, and then that's the Army. And then this is yet another image from the Hoji Shinbun Collection. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful photos, many of them. This is Koto, Yamao Koto, or Koto Yamao, the midwife. And then she encouraged women folks in her community, the plantation camps, put together a whole bunch of imon bukuro, put them in the wooden boxes, and then these were ready to be shipped to Japan for the Army. Now, often included in these handmade gift bags were imonbun, personal letters immigrant women and then also school-age children wrote in Japanese. And then for the second generation, it was not an easy thing to write things in Japanese, so they quite often relied on the manuals that were being imported from Japan. And when these manuals came, they were advertised in the ads published by the local establishment and in the newspaper. So as Kaoru was saying, advertisements are really another wonderful source into the Japanese diaspora history. Now, the making of senninbari, 1,000 stitch amulet, also became a common sight across the islands. A piece of rectangular fabric was embellished with 1,000 stitches by 1,000 women, and then it turned into an amulet believed to protect its wearer from dangers in battle. And then the image you see on the right, that's both of them are actually from Japanese Hawaii. The image you see on the right, that's very familiar in the Japanese scene. And then those of us who do gender and the women's studies, we all know that. Finding this image, not one, not two, but then quite a few within the world of Japanese Hawaii was quite startling. So women huddling together and then taking turns and then making tiny, tiny stitches. On the left, that's another Sennin Valley 1,000 stitch amulet. This one made by Toshiko Ise, and then she signed off with her own blood. These handmade gifts are combined with other offerings, including monetary donation called Juppeikin, and then also scrap metals and then rubber, and then shipped across the Pacific to fuel Japan's expansionism. So here's the main argument that I want to share with you today. The argument I want to present today is twofold. First, I contend that the Japanese immigrant nationalism did indeed exist and then actually gained traction in pre-war Hawaii. However, the patriotism of overseas Japanese was never a simple or straightforward affair, and then other dynamics intervened to complicate the texture of this Japanese immigrant nationalism. So I'm saying that yes, Japanese immigrant nationalism did exist, but I immediately qualify that statement by saying that it was really complicated. And what strikes us as this fervent, uprising about the patriotic feelings and then sentiment, there are so many other things going on, and we have to attend to that. But that's one set of argument. Second, I approach 1930s Hawaii as a jumping off point to consider broader questions concerning history and then historical writing. A seemingly trivial, really trivial story about women and handicraft actually provides surprising opportunities to reconsider a series of assumptions, informing, and then quite often actually restricting our historical understanding and then imagination. And then there are about 4 issues I want you to think along with me as I'm going to share with you more information about this particular topic. One is the role and place of women and then gender. And then when we think about gender, I think we want to think about not only femininity, but also masculinity as well. The second issue that, the materials that I'm going to share with you allow us to think about is the so-called presumed boundary between Japan and then Japanese America. Dr. Asma certainly really explored this question, but in this case too, the case I'm presenting, the boundary seems to be really, really porous. The third is the question of indigeneity, and then I might say sort of absent presence of indigenous populations in the geographical or other context we are looking at when we are thinking about Japanese diaspora dispersion. In today's case, I specifically am going to talk about Okinawans and then Hawaiians. And then fourthly, the prevalence of so-called terra-centrism, an exclusive focus on land that obscures the significance of sea and the ocean. And then just looking at the cover images of Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, the business magazine I was telling you about, it's very interesting. On the left, you see a sort of the classic pioneer agricultural farmer Japanese immigrant, but then immediately inside there's an advertisement about Toyoki-sen, so transoceanic, ship lines. The one on the right is even more telling. From Japanese Hawaii, all these lines are radiating in various places across the Pacific and then indicating sort of the expansive nature of Japanese maritime empire right then and there. Now, to explore these dynamics, where did I turn to? Of course, I turned to Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection, created by the Japanese Diaspora Initiative. Now, immersing myself in this archival collection is very similar to examining a tapestry of mesmerizing hues and texture. You stand transfixed by its exceptional subtlety and then complexity. gaze long enough and the manifold threads interwoven with never before seen pattern come into focus. And I'm not exaggerating. This is actually the way it happened when I was doing my own research. Full of intriguing details, the collection opens new vistas for historians of Asia and the Pacific. And from the collection's many treasures, today I specifically focus on 3 journalistic gems. One is Nippu Jiji newspaper, established in 1906. Another, Hawaii Hochi, established in 1912. And then the third, Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, established in 1911. Now, Hawaii Hochi and Nippu Jiji were daily newspapers, many of you know, run by Fred Kinzaburo Makino from Yokohama, Japan originally, and then Yasutaro Soga from Tokyo, Japan originally, respectively. So these are very interesting discursive space, but then Japanese-ness is really at the center and the front. In contrast to that, Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, edited by Tetsuo Toyama, guy from a man from Anaha, Okinawa, was a monthly business magazine whose readers included both Japanese and then also Okinawans. So in contrast to the first two, the business magazine is more like a hybrid Japanese and then Okinawan space. In much of the existing studies about Japanese immigrants, Japanese diasporic communities, Okinawans tend to be invisible. When they're talked about, they quite often appear as sort of the victims of more than one oppression. But what I found out in my own research is that Okinawans really express their agency in sometimes surprising manner, and their tenacity really comes across if you follow small print in those news papers. Just in case, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Okinawa and then its history, Okinawa was colonized by Japan just about the same time Hawaii was colonized by the United States, and then both of these things taking place in the late 19th century. And then since then, Okinawans were treated as second-class citizens in Japan and in Japanese Hawaii. So when we think about this, Doho community, communities of those who are compatriots, Okinawan presence within that space was at best tenuous and then very precarious. And what's going to happen in the next couple of minutes is that as I traced Okinawans, sort of the footsteps, then the line directly led from there to Hawaii indigenous communities. So that is going to happen in a few minutes. So having said this, it was a little bit long introduction, but then having said all this, let us go back to the exuberant scene of Asama and Yakumo pulling their commanding figures into the Honolulu harbor one June morning. Now, to appreciate the symbolic power of this scene, it is useful to know, for example, that Asama and Yakumo had served in the Russo-Japanese War, that naval war that opened a new chapter in Japan's modern history and also military imperial history. To add to this national and the nationalist significance, the vessels carrying Kozoku Gunjin, soldiers of royal blood, the vessels were carrying Kozoku Gunjin or soldiers of the royal blood, and then therefore somehow functioning as a sort of floating empires going across the Pacific and then marking Japanese presence there. And to give you a little bit more sense about this naval tour, training tour, 1935 tour, with which I started my presentation today. This is their route map, published in Yakumo newspaper. They started from Japan, went through Southeast Asia, stopped by Australia and New Zealand, came to Hawaii, and then cut back to Japan, going through the Nanyo. This was just one route, and then this was a relatively short one. The longer one, just a few years apart. They went all the way down to Panama Canal, which of course was a very important site in terms of American imperialism, American naval imperialism, and then forever associated with imperial figures like Teddy Roosevelt. As these naval vessels and then Navy trainees go all over the Pacific, of course, they came in contact with the indigenous islanders across the Pacific. On the left, that's New Zealand, and then on the right, South Sea. And then categorically, these Pacific Islanders were referred to as dojin, racist epithet for indigenous islanders. So vessels themselves, their movements in the ocean are very, very interesting. But then equally interesting were these young cadets whose picture you've seen earlier. Cadets on board were graduates of the Naval Academy in Etajima, a British-style institution whose students, well known for their masculine beauty, developed an intensely body-centered and then male-centered culture. And I'm going to come back to this later. And then these ships and these cadets came to Hawaii very often prior to World War II. Between 1876 and 1939, the visits of Imperial Navy training vessels to the islands, to Hawaii, numbered more than 40, an indication that Hawaii was a nodal point in this masculine expansionist scheme that we are looking at. At the center of this dynamic seascape proliferating across the Pacific was imon bukuro, comfort bag, an artifact handcrafted by Hawaii Toho and then showcasing their sekisei, meaning sincere passion. And then if you look into the newspapers, vernacular newspapers of this decade, and then before and then after, Doho and then sekisei were two circulating terminologies. Doho on the left, it literally means those born from the same womb. So talking about the gender sexual dynamics underscoring all this, it's evident. Sekisei is on the right, meaning sincere passion. And so this is a sort of a naval dynamic, but then it was not only Navy personnel receiving this. The link between the islands and the homeland, sewing and then soldiering, was not limited to the naval circuit. The start of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 sparked a large-scale military development in mainland Asia, mainland China, and the donation drive accelerated at home and then abroad among overseas Japanese. So imon bukuro, imon bun, and then senninbari, comfort bags, and then comfort letters, and then 1,000 stitch amulet loaded onto the commercial liners and then sailed across the sea to console those engaged in so-called sacred war in mainland Asia. So in terms of both Navy and then Army, there are some common themes right then and then there. Japanese immigrant nationalism centered on women's hands and then hearts, sustained by sea routes, and then linking Japan and then Japanese America was very much a visible feature in 1930s Hawaii. However, and then here's a big capital letter, however, Japanese immigrant nationalism was extraordinarily complex phenomena, and a variety of factors confounded its apparent intent. So given the limitation of time, I'm going to talk about 4 such complications or wrinkles, since we are talking about textile, wrinkles, mostly focusing on the Navy. In the published chapter, I also talked about the Army side stories as well. Now, to begin, so here's one first complication. To begin, this artifact that I'm talking about, the imon bukuro, comfort bag, a gendered symbol of Japanese nationalism, was actually very much foreign in origin, more specifically American and then British, and then quite transnational in its genealogy. During the American Civil War of 1861 to 65, the making of care packages was actually a very popular activity among American women, both in the North and then South. And then often included in these care packages American women were making was a tiny handmade satchel containing a sewing kit you see on the left, variously called housewife, asif, diddy bag, or comfort bag. And then this became a sort of source or archetype of Japanese imon bukuro or Japanese comfort bag. Well, in addition to becoming an archetype for Japanese comfort bag, it also became a trigger of the sewing culture among Civil War soldiers and then veterans. So the connection between sewing and then soldiering, and then the phenomena of sort of the militarized domesticity was enacted not by women alone, but then also men as well. And the history really doesn't stop with America, it goes further back. The American care package in turn took its inspiration from Victorian England, where the Crimean War of 1853 to 56 sparked the home front mobilization. So to send comfort from home to their loved ones on distant battlefields, British women, especially Queen Victoria, spent endless hours sewing shirts and then knitting mittens. And there too, sewing crossed a gender line and then gained popularity among men, as you see in this picture on the right, convalescent soldier doing patchwork as a form of rehabilitation. The practice of imon bukuro comfort bag was introduced to Japan by a member of the WCT Women's Christian Temperance Union, a major organization, on the eve of the Russo-Japanese War. So once again, that war, and then spread like wildfire. And this original idea of a hasef sort of retained its form. So within Japanese comfort bags, quite often you will find sewing kit like this you see on the left. And then in Japan too, among the soldiers, sewing and then also knitting seemed to gain popularity. But there's further documentation about that compared to American and then British counterparts. And then I'm still looking for the documentation about this. Now, once in Hawaii, once this artifact with a very interesting transnational background came to Hawaii, it acquired additional wrinkles and layers. So this is the second complication that I'm going to share with you today. For example, pro-Japanese donation campaign in which imon bukuro comfort bag was a centerpiece were never entirely voluntary. Participation was expected, quite often enforced. A social obligation hard to skirt in a tight-knit ethnic community. And then putting further pressure on this already stressful situation was intra-ethnic rivalry. So Japanese immigrants competed with each other in quantity and in quality of their donations. And this phenomena was not confined to Hawaii, but then spread across North and South America, Southeast Asia, and then involving eventually mainland Japan itself. In this transpacific competition, Hawaii Japanese insisted that their imon bukuro was superior to all others, packed with exotic items only available in Hawaii, such as Kona coffee, doll pineapple, canned pineapple, and then also hula dolls. Their gift bags were one of a kind. That's the way they describe their own creation. During the 1930s, vernacular newspaper that I introduced earlier published a steady stream of soldiers' testimonials celebrating and then praising the exceptional quality of Hawaii comfort bag or Hawaii imon bukuro. The one you see on the left, it's obvious all these sailors having received on this occasion 4 comfort bags each. They were really pleased and having a really big grins on their faces. The one on the right, here's another treasure from the Hoji Shinbun Digital Collection, and it's really a precious one. This is an illustration that accompanied a thank you letter that was sent from South China to Hawaii. So the soldier who received, the Imperial Japanese soldier who received comfort bag, wrote a letter, thank you letter, to the creator in Hawaii, and then he made a point of drawing something to accompany the letter. And then he drew himself, the one on the left is himself, and then he's saying, mine came from Hawaii, and then he's clutching it. Actually quite cute. He also made a point of drawing the other two, and then I don't know from where you're standing, sitting, whether you can see it or not, but do you see knee patches? Yeah, so these men themselves must have sewn it, and he made a point of showing all these stitches there. However, self-serving, this dynamic where Japanese in Hawaii boasting their own creation really had much to do with the immigrants' wish to vindicate themselves vis-a-vis Japan, an issue carefully explored by Dr. Asma in his groundbreaking book, Between Two Empires, Race, History, and Transnationalism, in Japanese. And then as he argues, and as I repeat here, overseas Japanese, long stigmatized as uncouth and then uneducated, were more than eager, you might say desperate, to demonstrate their worth and then regain their respectability. So stuffed into all these handmade gift bags we are talking about were possibly Nikkei frustration, overseas Japanese frustration, and even resentment toward the mistreatment they had endured for decades as Kimin discarded people at the hands of their own countrymen. So as much as they talked about this item, this artifact, as the symbol of their love of the country, there are way more different things were going on. And further complicating Japanese immigrant nationalism was a matter of economy, more specifically the immigrants' desire for profit making. So this is the third complication I wanted to share with you today. Each naval visit, as you imagine, sparked a business boom called kantai keiki in Japanese Hawaii. Under the banner, Welcome Imperial Navy Training Fleets, Japanese, and also importantly, Okinawan proprietors of restaurants, gift shops, gas stations, liquor stores, hotels, and then inns advertised their goods and then services. So what you see on the left, in each cell, it says Welcome Imperial Japanese Navy and the name of the establishment, and then pages after pages after pages. Appeared in the business magazine, Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, and then also in the vernacular newspaper. One of them who advertised their merchandise, Motoshige General Store, you see the advertisement on the right. Motoshige General Store promoted the sale of kachidoki, translated as shouts of victory, and then what they were selling was actually a pesticide to exterminate ticks and then flies and then bedbugs. And the Motoshige General Store, this is just one of the examples. There were other establishments doing the similar things. So Star Brand of the Mid-Pacific Corner Coffee Factory boasted of the popularity of its product, coffee, among members of the Japanese Navy, especially among the officers. Sato Clothing Store, another major establishment in Japanese Hawaii, enticed customers to visit the shop and then try on its ready-made Western clothing, size for Japanese, and then navy blue in color, of course, for the onboard reception event at home. That's the event that I was talking about earlier. So the love for the homeland was inseparable from the love for profit. And the profit motive indeed often outpaced the patriotic commitment, and the Nikkei community, Japanese American community in Hawaii, equally welcomed American naval fleets. Cheerful American sailors, hogaraka na suihei-san, were precious customers whose purchasing power was as valuable as their Japanese counterparts. So the newspaper layout like this, on the top part, you see the newspaper is excitedly talking about the arrivals of the American Navy fleet, their training, their exercise is about to start, and then hogaraka na suihei-san, cheerful American sailors coming in and then generating the economic boom. But then right below, you see another article which is about them, Japanese immigrant community, talking about the need to start making imon bukuro because Japanese Imperial Navy vessels were coming very soon as well. This sort of double loyalty of Japanese immigrants was well observed in Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, and then it's that business magazine I was telling you about. To celebrate the Japanese naval visits, the magazine published special welcome issues full of Japanese and then Okinawan advertisement with their covers featuring a Japanese naval fleet and then also the rising sun flag. The same magazine, however, also embraced the economic boom kantai keiki brought by American naval visits, publishing special issues showing the portraits of American naval commanders and then publicizing their merchandise in English on this occasion. So Japanese immigrants' love for sailors was not at all exclusive after all. Affection for the old country did not contradict and then indeed often coexisted with attachment to the new country. Now, entwined with these economic dynamics that I just talked about was militourism, a term popularized by the late Teresia Teaiva, indigenous Pacific feminist scholar, and illuminating the confluence of militarism and tourism, tours of duty and then tours of pleasure. During the naval visits, Japanese imperial naval visits, the appropriation of things Hawaiian was a recurring feature within Japanese American community. So the comfort bags made by Japanese immigrant women embodied the true spirit of aloha. That's the way immigrants themselves describe their creation. Among items recommended for inclusion in imon bukuro were kanaka dolls or Hawaiian dolls. And then really the deployment of Hawaiian bodies was not simply figurative, as in the case of kanaka dolls, but then sometimes quite literal. So the welcome program included a hula performance where young cadets from Imperial Japan were entertained by indigenous female performers. And then when gender scholars, including myself, looking at the picture like this, we immediately start talking about a feminization of Hawaii and the masculinization of Imperial Japan. And the feminization of Hawaii was not limited to this particular occasion, as you see in the next rather startling picture. The scene of an indigenous man, bare-chested and then barefoot, presenting a floral bouquet to Japanese naval officers dressed in pristine white uniforms, highlighted the hierarchical relation between Imperial Japan and then indigenous Hawaii, a relationship mediated by Japanese immigrants who had settled in the island. So at one level, we can take this as a gendered, hierarchical image. But if you want to think about this image in connection to one of the earlier images that I showed you, that, body-centered, male-centered culture of Japanese Navy and the Naval Academy, you might start giving altogether a different kind of interpretation, more thinking about male-to-male intimacy or possibly male-to-male affection. So these images really render themselves to varieties of interpretation. The politics of indigeneity that I'm talking about here was notable in another way as well. The Japanese naval visits generated a close discursive encounter between two indigenous groups, Hawaiians and then Okinawans. And this was observed, among other things, in the October 1936 welcome issue welcoming Japanese Navy imperial vessels of Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, a business magazine under the editorship of an Okinawan journalist. This welcome issue, intended as a guidebook for those arriving, those aboard the visiting fleets, provided light reading on Hawaiian history and then Hawaiian culture. And among those that were published in this special issue, one piece entitled Japanese Empire and King Kalakaua described the indispensable role the king had played in Japan's overseas development. And unlike other occasions here, he wasn't referred to as dojin, that problematic racialized term, but then more treated and portrayed as the noble savage. So what were the narratives within this special issue? Here's the story, or stories they told. During his around the world tour in 1881, and it's a very famous around the world tour King did, the king had visited Japan and then met with Meiji Emperor Mutsuhito. And it was then and then there the king had proposed Japanese immigration to Hawaii and thereby laid the foundation for Japanese propagation. They used the term hanshoku in the Pacific. Eager to build a political alliance, King had also made another proposal during the same meeting, and then that's a proposal of marriage of Princess Kailani to Prince Higashimi of Japan, who later became a career officer in the Imperial Navy. At the time, she was about 5 or 6, and then Higashimi around 9, and this marriage never took place. But the story of Princess Kaiulani really circulate within Hawaii to this day. Now, according to the magazine, the king's affinity to Japan was genuine. And then to prove that point, it went on to tell other stories within the same space of the article. Once returning to the islands, the king had welcomed the first contingent of Japanese immigrants by visiting the immigration station or the waterfront and then performing hula to comfort the new arrivals. So it goes back to the dynamic that I was talking about earlier. Eliminating a series of intimate connections between indigenous Hawaii and then imperial Japan, the peace legitimized and then indeed naturalized the Doho presence in the islands. Indigenous islanders, Okinawans, and then Hawaiians were then clearly part of the tangled web of domination and then subordination proliferating across the Pacific. Their presence, indigenous presence, often obscured by regions' dominant geopolitical forces and then continuously stifled by the prevailing analytical categories in academia, actually provides yet another point of departure, another analytical point of departure as we try to reimagine and then re-envision the region's past. And then very appropriately, the cover image of our volume is that image of the departure. And then thanks to Kaoru for picking that image. Very interesting image right then and there. So that's what I prepared for today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Koikari, for your inspiring talk. We'd like to take questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. I have a question from the remote audience asking if Imperial Japanese servicemen had a positive view of Hawaii and overseas Japanese. Why did Imperial leadership have such a dim view of them? Do you have any comment? Oh, okay. So why do the Imperial servicemen and Imperial leadership, their views differ on the Japanese, overseas Japanese and Hawaii?
At one level, when you look at all these historical materials, yes, Imperial Japanese Navy personnel said all the wonderful things. And then they were very entertaining and they were very nice to immigrant communities. But if you start looking into their diaries or their recollections, things they have written, it was not always the case. They did look down upon them as well. So there are sort of double views going on. And then depending on the occasion, different ones came out to serve the purpose.
Additional comments?
About the negative view of immigrant or iming as a kiming, abundant people, it has a longer history and it's kind of entrenched it in the public sort of a mindset of a Meiji Japan, and that has to do with how that the overseas migration started. With that, the plantation workers, poor plantation workers leaving Japan out of desperation, that's the perception, right? And they're poor people, no skills, no education, going to Hawaii, work like slaves on the plantation. So that's the beginning of Japanese migration, sort of a history in the mind of most Japanese people. So it's sort of class-based sort of prejudice against the people who left Japan, particularly for work and so forth. And so that's the kind of basis of this idea of imin as a kiming. And so that's a sort of a general sort of background that the Professor Koikari talked about. So yeah, that's something I want to add to.
Hello, I'm Jaja. Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I'm interested in what you mentioned, the double loyalty. I guess this was in the 1930s. Japanese immigrants were also welcoming the U.S. Navy. As you go into late 1930s, or maybe early 1940s, like 1940, early 1941, do you see a change in the way they view the two navies? Was there like a growing dilemma among them? Thank you.
So with Pearl Harbor, basically, and then even prior to that, 1940, the naval visits stopped, and then the war happened. As soon as the war began, these Japanese immigrant women did about face, and then started doing victory imon bukuro campaign for American soldiers. So this becomes a really interesting window. But then, so that happens throughout World War II, right? And the war ends. And then Japan now became US ally. And then Japanese maritime self-defense forces in its earliest form resumed long-distance training across the Pacific. So members of the newly rebuilt, the newly created Japanese maritime forces came in, and then they started the same thing. They started giving imon bukuro. They started making senninbari. Sometimes they recycled senninbari from wartime and then give it to the members of the American Self-Defense Forces. So as much as we want to think 1945 or 1940 for that matter, is this sort of cutoff point and then things changed. If when you look at women's material culture, as this is the case, there is a long continuity. So, and then also just to add one more, Japanese immigrants are also making 1,000 stitch amulet and also comfort bags for Japanese American soldiers, Nisei soldiers, serving in the US military as well. So it went to all sorts of directions.
I have another question from the remote audience. Does the ongoing affinity the Japanese immigrants in Hawaii felt for Japan differ from that of other US immigrants felt for their native country?
That, I don't know, and I don't even know how to compare that. Immigrants of different nationalities, so how Japanese immigrants, their attachment to Japan, how does that compare to, let's say, German immigrants or Italian immigrants or Chinese immigrants for that matter? Do you have any idea?
In the, I guess, most generic terms, being immigrant is actually, it's kind of difficult to choose one or the other, right? I mean, you're still connected to your home country. In Japanese case, they're like still, subject to Japan because of the US denial of naturalization rights. But even like for German immigrants during World War I, they became really the target of persecution. And then because of the German immigrants actually maintained a connection to Germany, not maybe the political entity, maybe, or the culture. Of course, Americans usually mix them up, right? So then, the Midwestern state passed like anti-German school laws and all those things. And in that way, there's a similarity between what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II and then, what happened to German immigrants during World War I, although Germans are, of course, not incarcerated. Right? So then, I guess the question is, in order to really understand the immigrant, I guess this is sort of a common theme, I think, is something we want to keep in mind. Immigrants usually cannot choose one or the other. Sometimes they perform, right? Or show, if they need to, then they show that, I'm 120% American or whatever. But then I don't think that's really actually like reflection of a real sort of mindset. That's the reason why, as Professor Koikari mentioned, you can actually see that the Japanese immigrant doing the same thing, basically even after the war, but now for the US or whatever, right? So then, and then of course the same question can be actually asked about the connection of, say, Jewish immigrants or Jewish Americans have to state of Israel, for example, right? And then so I think there is some commonality about the immigrant sort of mentality, where that they cannot choose, and it force them to choose one, I think, is kind of cruel in a sense. So that's sort of a general comment I wanted to make.
Any questions from the floor? I have more questions coming in from the remote audience. Don't have any from the floor. To what extent did Yosai Kenbo ideology play a part in shaping women's activities, supporting Japanese male imperialist activities?
That I don't know. This work is not specifically about that. They certainly tried to be proper Japanese immigrant women. But the Ryosai Kembo, as I understand it, that's, especially in Japanese context, really had a lot to do with reproductive activities as well. I certainly didn't see that, reproducing more and more the political call within Japanese American context.
So this might be some difference between Hawaii and California in this case, because in California, having kids, Nisei children with U.S. citizenship, actually was very important because of the existence of alien land law, for example, where the Japanese immigrants are denied the right to own land. Those are state laws. Many Western states passed those laws, right? So having Nisei kids with U.S. citizenship and then serve as a guardian of these U.S. citizen kids to actually, and the kids own the land as a U.S. citizen, right? But then as a guardian, immigrant parents could continue to farm, basically, right? That situation did not exist in Hawaii because Hawaii didn't pass the alien land law. So there might be some difference there, but that's the only thing I can sort of think of. So then for California, Issei, having Nisei kids is very important for that practical reason.
Hello, this is Issei Matsumoto. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I had a question about the source Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii. You had some really fabulous images. In particular, there's one that I just snapped a quick picture of, but it's a photo of kind of a agricultural worker facing the sun, and it's kind of like either a goodbye or a hello, probably a hello to the rising sun. And I thought it was kind of interesting that it's kind of a business magazine, but it's embracing kind of the agricultural laborer roots of the Japanese community in Hawaii. Could you talk a little bit more about Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii, the readership? Like who was it circulated among the business interests, particularly in Honolulu, or was this a publication that had mass readership? Thank you very much.
I sense that it's among all these business owners who are quite often in the leadership position of a variety of organizations of Japanese immigrants, especially Issei immigrants, more often than not in Honolulu, not other places. So you are more thinking about all these rural plantation camp communities. I'm sure they read it, but I didn't see in terms of leadership. They were represented within the city-centered business leaders. So that's one answer. Why is that question?
I asked that question just because I look at that a lot of Hawaii periodicals in the immigrant community, and my presentation later today will actually be kind of on the topic. So it's very interesting to me. Thank you so much.
Matt, one quick thing. This is also, I think, the contribution that Professor Stefan's making, but I think that journal was also advocating that for some people with money and resources, moving to Manchuria during the 1930s it's kind of presented as an option. So that's, I think, very important, maybe the background as well.
Hello, I'm Yiting Chung. Thank you for your presentation. And I had a question of wondering if you could share with us more about your observations on the role of Okinawans, especially in the making of the Japanese immigrant nationalism. And for example, you shared the making of different feminine objects. Do you observe a difference in terms of the behaviors of Okinawans with other people from the Japanese proper? Thank you.
In terms of the sewing campaign and the imon bukuro campaign, yes, they were looking at Japanese, let's say, Navy personnel as a target, right, at one level. But then below that level, they really, really, really want to give their gifts to the people who are coming from the same prefecture or same region. So if there are some, let's say, Fukushima contingent or other people from the given prefecture among the members of the Navy training vessels that get published in the newspapers, and they hold special event, and they're really like wanting to give additional things to those people. So within that context, yes, there were attempts to, cater to, Okinawan interest, even though the number was very, very few. So one thing that I couldn't talk really in detail, but really interesting mention given your question is that those inter-ethnic rivalry, it happened on a prefecture basis. It even happened at sort of the city or other bases. So they were constantly looking at each other and trying to see how we are going to outdo other groups. So all these excitement, that seems to be simply patriotic excitement. There are other layers of feelings and emotions and then dynamics are going on. And then all together, and then following what Asuma-san was saying, what's really interesting about all these immigrants are their ability to negotiate, the constant negotiation, always doing something, thinking something, and then engaging in the environment. Within that context, I thought it was very interesting that Okinawan community was part of this mobilization. They have to economically survive. They have to survive within the Japanese dominant communities. So they ended up doing all sorts of things.
All right, thank you, Michelle, and thank you again for such an eye-opening paper. Building on Issei's question, I'm also interested in Jitsugyo-no-Hawaii. So I think, if I remember correctly, there's a Jitsugyo-no-Nihon published in Japan. Are they connected?
That I don't know.
Okay, because I used some article on Jitsugyo-no-Nihon, some Japanese Issei wrote home to just boast their successful businesses in the mainland U.S. And I'm just wondering if there's any connection between Jitsugyo-no-Nihon and Hawaii. Okay, so there's no. I have a second quick question.
Well, okay, I don't know. So
okay.
If you look deeper into it, you might find it. It could be the case where, Tetsuo Toyama, knowing Jitsugyo-no-Nihon, imitated the title. That could happen too. A similar thing happened in U.S. occupied Okinawa, looking at mainland Japan, creating a similar kind of graphic magazine. So in terms of transactions between these two areas, if you're interested in that, I think it's worth looking into it.
Okay, thank you so much. Allow me to pose second question. So my second question is about donation. I think one of the things the Japanese community did in the 1930s is to solicit donations, like money, not the object necessarily. So in Hawaii, if people solicit donation for the Japanese empire, are these activities done by women or men? Do you know?
I think it's more often male leaders and then leadership. And then they're the ones who are in touch with this division in Japanese military, which bears the same name, Juppebu. So that's, that's the entity they were in. Quite often, including that 1,000 stitch amulet signed off with the blood. In that case, that whole creation was brought to the local newspapers. So my sense is that newspapers quite often took a role as a deliverer and then sent it off to Japan. I'm guessing the same goes for money, but do you want to comment on that?
Don't know anything about Hawaii, but in California or the mainland case, I guess, there's a gender division there. I think the money usually handled or sort of a kind of raised by men. And they even have a heim shakai where the members actually had to donate like 50 cents or $1 every month or something. So money, right? But then there are things like comfort, whatever, this and that. I think usually female doing that, and the kids actually collecting like all those scrap metals and stuff like that. That's also things.
Yeah.
Right? So there's California or the mainland case, there's a division, gender division between money, men actually handle that, but then things by women.
And then following that, as you might expect, it's quite often men, leaders, who told women to make hundreds or thousands or whatsoever initially. So when they were not well organized, by the time we reached 1930s, the machinery of that donation was well in place. But if you look at 1920s, for example, like 2 weeks before, Japanese male leaders turn around and then tell women, okay, within 3 days, we need like 500. And then women were actually doing. I don't know what they felt. It doesn't show up in the newspaper, but then you can well imagine. As we get into the 30s, and then the newspaper started praising women's work. So that becomes an incentive to pull into the particular mobilization that was done there.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I have a question which I think you've partially answered, or I've gotten bits and pieces of what I imagine the answer might be, but I was wondering about the imon bukuro, which in the newspaper sources which you cited, they were really presented as something that was spontaneous, and the kind of spontaneous outburst of patriotism. But I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the social networks within the Nikkei community, which may have pressured people or encouraged people to put these together. Yeah.
So first and foremost, the order, and then organizational sort of the mandate came from Issei male leaders. But among women, they were not doing this individually. They were doing this as a part of Buddhist groups or other kind of social entities. Sometimes one person belonging to multiple entities, and they were doing this. So, and then here's my guess, as a gender scholar, having looked at all these things, as much as it is the unwanted labor women have to do, as much as it's a part of something larger they cannot touch out there, it brought women together. And then it created women's community. Just imagine what kind of conversations took place, what kind of mutual support may be taking place. So these women's organizations that get created in the war context or mobilization context or whatever, that really wouldn't directly benefit them, still create some very interesting space among women. At the same time, I'm sure it's a huge pressure for these women to try to outdo other women. And then there are women leaders, right, who are supervising them. So my speculation is I can only guess there are all sorts of interesting dynamics among women based on their class or other kind of differences.
One sort of observation based on the California case, again, I don't know about Hawaii, but women have been kind of merged now really in a community politics except for the education issue. But this actually allowed women to be really the kind of center of the community politics. This was really the center of political issue that the immigrant community actually dealt with and so forth, right? Now the women are actually competing with men, actually basically on the sort of level field, basically, even though they got divided like a money things and then imon kind of division there, but they are competing in terms of the level of sort of a patriotism. They could actually kind of show off vis-a-vis men's, patriotism, right? So I think that for women, this was a very important kind of device to kind of sort of lift them up, so to speak, in the community context, kind of having a kind of political voice in a way.
Yeah, create a space within the public. So remember, I was telling you, imon bukuro circulating within US and then England came to Japan on the eve of the Russo-Japanese War. It was the leaders of Japanese WCTU who very consciously picked it up, and they used it as their show of support for the Japanese imperial endeavor, so as to firm up their very fragile, sort of the ground within the Japanese within the Japanese national context at the time. So as I've been saying over and over, negotiations and agency, Definitely, if you look at the imon bukuro long enough, as I have done, you begin to see many interesting ways in which people like women or Okinawans or other people are doing their stuff, and we tend to ignore, but they are interesting. Micropolitics right there. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for attending today's public talk. We are actually providing a promo code for book purchase if you are interested in that.